Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the organizers, to Ambassador Pillai for the kind words. Particularly, may I thank the Secretary for being so good as to come. I discovered we have an Australian connection. And I'd especially like to thank the two people on the panel today, because this is no ordinary panel, in that both of them bring extraordinary knowledge and qualifications to talk about waste and waste management. Mr. Gautam Reddy's come from Hyderabad for this. He's the CEO of India's premier corporate organization that works in the field of waste management. And Shubhagato, of course, is known to many of you as a colleague, and through his work at the Center for Policy Research on questions of waste, but more important, on urban government. And of course, urban government and waste are inseparably tied. My thought was that I could talk a little bit about how this book came about, but then to try to put it in the context of a contribution of some kind to the better organization of the way in which we handle throwaway things in India, of course, but also globally, because Australia at the moment is plunged into a crisis of waste management with China's national soil policy, which means no more random or slightly soiled plastics and paper are going to go to China, and Australia, which has become accustomed to sending container loads of its own recyclables to China, is now having to deal with these itself, and this is imposing huge burdens on local governments. This book, though, began before the Swachh Bharat campaign, and it began out of a book that my friend Asa Doron and I did on mobile phones. And in the course of writing the book about mobile phones, we became interested in what happened to dead mobile phones in India. Because by 2010-11, you could see piles and piles of scrap phones. Phones were being thrown away, and we wondered what had happened to them. And Asi, who is the anthropologist, made some inquiries in Delhi, and they said, look, the people down at one of the big markets said, look, if you really want to see what's happened to this stuff, go out to Selampur, which, as many of you know, is a suburb of Delhi. Asi went out to Selampur and discovered that in Selampur there was a great deal of recycling the electronic goods, but he also saw things that, he has two small sons, they were small then, they're bigger now, but two little boys, and he saw little kids with those little kerosene burners that we use in India to heat water in. Kerosene cookers with a saucepan on them, and some mobile phones cooking in the saucepan to soften the plastic so the little fingers could dart in and pull out the valuable pieces of metal. And he came back from that to our very comfortable bed and breakfast in New Delhi. He said, we've got to do a book about waste. This is awful, this is amazing. I can't believe what I've just seen. The fumes from the pots, the hot plastic, all of these things. So I'm always a bit skeptical of these things, but eventually he sold me on the idea, and I got interested as a historian. He's an anthropologist, one of those people who just likes to talk to other people. And it often seems to me anthropologists do an awful lot of talking, but they have one virtue, it seems to me, and he has that in abundance. He will never go to bed at night without writing up his notes. So you'll say goodnight to him at 11:30 and go to your room, and you know that until 1 o'clock he'll be sitting there banging away his computer, writing up the notes of the day's activities. And that's given us a wonderful bank of ideas and experiences which he's recorded through his contacts. My contribution is I've worked for years in what was called a politics department, but I was trained as a historian, so I've got an interest in public policy, and I love the idea of context. It's one of the reasons I like our new director so well. He does history, he doesn't just do something called international relations. I think you've got to have a historical context to understand contemporary problems. The contract for this book then was signed in July 2013, which was nearly a year before the BJP government was elected, and 14 months before the Prime Minister announced the Swachh Bharat, or Clean India, campaign. But of course that campaign gave what we were doing added relevance and urgency, and I have to say it was a spur to us because we thought we were doing something that was going to have a genuine contemporary relevance and interest. What we discovered as we went about learning, we all began, Javanti was asking me in the cab, did you know anything about this before you started? And I said, no. I didn't even know chemical symbols, but now I know that CH4 is a very bad thing to be breathing. You don't want to breathe CH4 if you can avoid it. So I've had to learn a little bit of chemistry, which I wish I'd remembered from year 10 at school, because we discovered ourselves that in order to present a connected account, we had to put together the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle and identify what those pieces ought to be, and then try to work out how they should be fitted into the puzzle as a whole, what the puzzle actually looked like. And the book found its structure in that way. I think perhaps that's what the book looks like, and I'm only sorry we didn't have thousands of copies to sell this afternoon, but we don't. But Jordan will take names of people who might like to acquire a copy. And it's available, of course, as a Kindle and on Amazon in various ways. And it's available much more cheaply in India, too, if you're going to India. The Indian edition is cheaper. The book found its structure in the jigsaw puzzle. A historian like me had to put India's position today in some sort of context. So the first chapter of the book is about time and place. And it really begins with Florence Nightingale in the 1860s, because after the Great Revolt of 1857, the British found they'd lost 10 times as many soldiers to disease as they had to bullets and bayonets and so on. And even the British government at that time, now that it was charged with the government of India, wanted to know why it was losing so many soldiers. So it did what modern management gurus would do. It sent a questionnaire out, and it sent it to 170 cantonments, military stations around India, asking, what are you doing? How do you look after the health, the water, the sanitation of your soldiers? And it got back probably 120, 130 replies, and you can imagine them arriving in London in a big box off a steam-combed sailing ship. And some poor secretary in the ministry would have said, what are we going to do with this lot? What do we do? And they said, well, Florence has just come back from the Crimea, and she's top-o on this public sanitation stuff. Send them to her. So they sent the questionnaires to Florence Nightingale, who wrote the most scathing report on what the questionnaires revealed. And some of the real zingers in this report that Florence wrote on the surveys were lines like, you have been in this country for 100 years, and you treat it worse than the worst slums of Manchester. That really goes on saying, you can't protect your soldiers if you don't do a better job of trying to protect people around them. And it's been a shocking mess, and you really need to pull up your socks and do something about it. So that's the beginning of bringing some forms of what was becoming modern urban public sanitation to India. And that story, of course, was never very successfully undertaken by the British, because it ran into various things like budgetary constraints and the wish always to put the responsibility for taking the blame onto Indian legislators, Indian public servants, and retain the control of finances by the colonial government. So the first chapter is about time and place. We also try to put India in the context of other countries, China, Japan, and so on. The Netherlands. The Netherlands, for example, in the 18th and 19th century people bid for the right to collect urine from individual households because of the valuable nitrogen and because of the agricultural nature of a lot of Netherlands life. Nitrogen was immensely valuable. Not something that happens in India, or I think has ever happened in India. Chapter 2 is, the next question was, why is waste in India seeming to be a greater problem today than when people like me first experienced India 50 years ago? And of course that really comes down to growth of population, and growth of an urban population, and growth of a middle class population, and all the industrial activity that goes with economic growth as well. So that's the second part, that India is growing rapidly. You may have seen as you came in a map with an overlay of the map of China at the same scale over a map of India. China is nearly 2.5 times bigger than India in size. India's population density amongst major countries in the world is only exceeded by Bangladesh. Singapore and the the island states and so on are exceptions, of course. So India has an almost unique problem in the magnitude and intensity that it has to deal with. Chapter 3 took us to the unmentionable question, liquid waste, human excrement particularly. And the matter of open defecation, of course, has been a signature for the Swachh Bharat campaign. The elimination of open defecation has been one of the prime targets, as I think everyone here who reads the newspapers will have seen, if not serious articles about the campaign, at least ones that are going sort of chuckle. Everybody likes a good sort of toilet joke, and providing it's polite and in good company. The open defecation campaign is just one part, of course, of the question. The big question that arises out of India's experience of public sanitation when it comes to human excrement is the one that says, when will someone invent the perfect toilet? The perfect toilet has not been invented. Sewage is not going to be, a sewer system is not going to be the answer for India or many other countries in the world, because there's not enough water to drive a sewage system, and the digging and disruption that goes with it is almost impossible to conceive in densely populated current urban settlements. So chapter 3 on liquid waste was the third part of our puzzle. The handicaps can be turned to advantages, and I think in spite of India's handicaps, and I think they're considerable in dealing with waste, there are a couple of things that actually work in its favor. One of them is the tradition of recycling. I think everybody over 30 has a kabari story. Everybody over 30 has a memory of some, usually female elder relative, haggling at the door with the kabari, the rag picker, when the rag picker came to do a small exchange for maybe a broken saucepan, more likely bottles, more likely paper. And that story, I think, is one that enlivens a lot of Indian fiction, as well as the experience of a great many of us. But that kabari tradition is marvelous, because it's recycling before the word recycling was coined. And India still has wonderful networks, not necessarily totally efficient, but nevertheless remarkably innovative, to collect things and then pass them up the scale, where value can be imparted again to thrown away items. The question then is, well, can technology fix all this? And that gave us our chapter 5. We wanted to look at the limitations and the possibilities of technological fixes to problems of waste. At the end of all that, it comes down to government. So chapter 6 was about local government. And as I suggested a moment ago, local government under the British and local government today, in spite of the amendments to the Constitution that enshrine local government as part of the Indian governmental system, unlike Australia, where local government isn't a constitutional necessity. In India, it is, but the local governments are underpowered, understaffed, without the authority to raise funds, without the authority to enforce bylaws, and because they can offer not particularly attractive career structures, they're impoverished too, or they're not sufficiently empowered in terms of talented, committed people. It's not to say there are none, but there aren't enough of that kind of person to drive on public sanitation projects, which after all are not glamorous. They're not particularly glamorous even in countries like Australia, where it's a much less demanding problem. Finally, the last chapter, our answer to many of these questions is people. People make waste, people have to clean up waste. And in the last chapter, which if there's time I gather on the program, I might come back and talk a little bit more about, is about categories of people who deal with waste. The professionals who come to waste with skills that they bring. Mr. Gautam Reddy is classic in that kind. Somebody who understands the science, but also understands the business and understands the markets that go with all of this. The second category we nominated were handlers, the people who actually do the dirty work. Just as the chairman was talking about low-status people who are charged every day with doing dirty tasks, often for insufficient reward with insufficient equipment and training. The recyclers were our third category, the kabaris, and all the people between low-level kabaris and very, very well-off kabaris. Not really kabaris at all, yet essentially performing the same task. And finally, we talked about facilitators, the NGOs, the civic action groups, the local presidential authorities that make India what it is. In many countries in the world, such activities are no longer permitted. In China, very hard, I think, to run an NGO independent of government. In India, in spite of the problems, the NGO sector presents some of the best activity in mobilizing people at all levels into a concerted waste action program, at least in localities. The problem, of course, is upscaling that. So the book finishes with the message that people manage waste. Caring for waste is vital on a planet of 7 billion people, which are increasingly urban. The change in behavior and practice are possible. And that kind of change has to be founded on convincing people of the benefits of change, including benefits of payment, respect, and prospects for the people who actually do the hands-on work. So it's a people-created problem. It must be a people-solved problem, a people-led solution. So that's, I think, the overall picture of the book. Thank you very much.